Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Pocono Liars Club. Once more, we're having a wonderful Zoom conference. Today, we're going to talk about humor in writing. And I've got two writers who specialize in humor. Not that that's the only thing they do, of course. But let's start by introducing everybody and tell us about why you're on this panel. Jody?
Hi, I'm Jody Lynn. I write science fiction and fantasy, most of it with a humorous bent. So that's the chief reason I'm here. And pretty much everything that I've ever done has a measure of humor in it. So I'm happy to talk about what makes it funny.
Alex?
Hi, I'm Alex Shvartsman. I write a lot of humorous short fiction and recently novels. This is the latest. The Middling Affliction is as humor as most novels get these days. So that qualifies. But I also edit a lot of humorous anthologies, including the Unidentified Funny Object series. So I read an awful lot of short fiction submissions that at least attempt to be humorous, and some of them succeed.
And my name is Michael A. Ventrella. I write novels that are humorous as well, and short stories, and I've also edited a bunch of anthologies, some of which have humor, and not all of them. But let's start. I'm trying to define my terms here, and I want to see if you guys agree with me, because I see a difference between humor and comedy. To me, humor you can have a serious story with humor in it. And comedy is the whole point of the story, is the comedy, and sometimes the humor is not as important as making a laugh, which means you might break the fourth wall, you might do satires and parody and things like that. So when I think about it, I try to think of humor as being like Guardians of the Galaxy is a humorous movie, although it's not a comedy in that sense, whereas Spaceballs is a comedy, if you see the distinction. Do you guys agree with that distinction, or do you have another distinction you would like to make?
Actually, I think that's a pretty good use of the terms that separates it, at least for the purposes of this argument this evening.
Alex?
Yeah, I completely agree. Generally, almost any movie, almost any book can benefit from some humor, especially as a way to release rising action. So you can't have rising action continue throughout the plot. You need some ways of breaking it up so that you can slow it down with a different scene, something reflective, and humor is a really good way. And that's why you see it in so many of the action movies. It's very rare, I think, to see an action movie that doesn't have humorous scenes in it, because it's such a good way to drop the action back down so that you could start rising action, like this linear thing again, where it keeps going up, up, up. Then some joke brings it down, and it starts rising again.
Yeah, nobody can sustain watching something suspenseful and tension creating without a moment of relief. So it makes it all the more effective, because if you can't have the highs, you can't really appreciate the lows.
What do you think are some books or films, actually, we can say that you think accomplish that very well with humor? We're not talking about comedy yet, but with humor.
The Keep by F. Paul Wilson is a horror novel. It takes place in an old castle in Europe during the Second World War. And I like to use this example because it's a grim story. Nazis have taken a lot of their prisoners there, and it's haunted by a demonic spirit. The demonic spirit is intelligent, which is good, because dumb creatures don't adapt well to humor. And one of the prisoners is a rabbi. He's being held in a lockdown room, and the demon decides out of the blue to check him out and then mess with him, because it comes through the wall and lunges towards him. And the rabbi, for whatever reason, sees a crucifix on the wall, snatches it and thrusts it at the monster, which chooses to recoil and then flees through the wall, leaving the rabbi with a crisis of conscience. So it's a great moment in the book, because it comes at a really neat and necessary point to drive the point home that this creature is intelligent and it has a sense of humor.
Alex?
My example is a bit of a gimme, but Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So when I was at Viable Paradise, the instructors were very bullish on the show as a way to teach new writers how to do dialogue really, really well. But I think this applies to injecting humor as well, because there's so much humor, both situational and other kinds, that is injected into the show, but nobody would ever make an argument that the show is in any way a comedy.
Correct. I'll agree with you there. And I think, to me, part of the fun in movies like that is, like you say, you want to have the breaks, and it also helps you like the characters too, you know? I mean, because I hardly go a day when there's not something funny that happens to me, or I talk about, or someone makes a joke. You know, that's life, you know, and it makes your character realistic and believable. When I think of authors who I think of as being humor authors as opposed to comedy authors, I obviously put Jody in that list. I might put, every once in a while, John Scalzi can be like that. Terry Pratchett sort of sometimes walks the line between humor and comedy, and he does it very well, I think. Whereas I would put Douglas Adams more in the comedy section.
Mhm.
Yeah, can you
I would agree with you on that. Yeah.
can you think of any other examples that you would give that you think would be authors who you think do this very well?
So I would argue that Terry does belong in the comedy section more, though he's closer to the border, but I think he's on that other side of the border. I think perhaps Neil Gaiman, an argument could be made that, you know, he's very much in that territory.
Not everything he does, but yes.
There's, you know, there's so many great authors that are doing this. Jeannie Koch, who is a frequent contributor to a lot of anthologies that you know the all of us have been in. You know, she certainly writes her novels with a lot of humor, but they're not comedies. They just have a lot of, you know, humor and action and romance in them.
Well, let's not forget that any story has to be a good story. And even the ones that are comedies need to have a story that's worthwhile, that's worth following, that we care about the progression of the characters through it. So to them, it's life and death. To us, it's funny, but to them, this is their life.
Well, I think
So-
The Jody just kind of touched upon the number one advice that I always offer. Like, if people ask me what's like the number one advice for writing humor in your stories, and my advice on that is make sure that if not a single joke lands for your reader, the story could still carry them along through its plot and action, and that way they can just say, hey, it wasn't really funny, but you know what, it was a good story anyway.
I think that's the key. Quite often when I read comedy stories or comedy novels, it seems they don't last. You know, I will laugh at them, but I feel like they're pulling jokes out of somewhere to make the jokes that don't really progress the story necessarily, or they change the story in order to make the joke. And I come across and I finish them and I feel not as satisfied as a good story that has humor in it. You know, I can rewatch Monty Python over and over again for the laughs, but it's not like I watch it for the great story or the character development or anything like that, you know?
No, absolutely. And the emphasis of adding humor to something, you can make a very grim story palatable to people, or a very difficult moment palatable by making people laugh. The great trial lawyer Melvin Belli always said, laughing juries never convict. And when you make people relax by making them laugh, they're able to absorb what you're saying a lot better than if you just hammered them with it.
I just won a trial last week after making the jury laugh, so I like that quote.
Good for you.
That's
well, there's your mentor there.
There you go. But let's talk about that, because if people who are watching this video want to know about their writing and how they can succeed and what editors are looking for, and I think it's important. What we're both all saying is that if you want to write comedy, your best bet is to have a story first and then try to get the comedy in it. Would you agree to that, or you think there are exceptions? I mean,
oh yeah, my late partner Robert Asprin would show people how to do a comic action scene by choreographing it to in a straightforward fashion, and then he said, okay, now we'll add the humor to it.
mm-hmm.
And this is where you add the fruit cart that everybody always runs into, the woman trying to chase a chicken across the road, and so on, into the action scene and incorporate it.
you can get away with a Monty Python skit as a short story, especially as a flash piece, or just sort of on the shorter end of like 2,000 to 3,000 words. The longer your story expands to, the more difficult it gets to carry on the joke, because at some point, especially if a joke is something that's sort of like trying to be unique and different, it can wear out its welcome pretty quickly. So after 20 pages, 30 pages of this, you're like, well, you know what? You're just doing the same thing over and over again. I'm now bored. So when you're doing a novel, it's actually better to use the humor a little bit more sparingly. So there's flashes of it. And if you place them really well, you can have the reader's loyalty. You can get away with almost any BS you want to, if they're laughing.
I agree. And I when I try to write humor, I do what Jody just said, is I try to think what can go wrong and what can get in the way of the plan that the heroes have made that ruins everything for them. But that's funny. I don't know how to describe it, but sometimes just things going wrong is funny. The chicken crossing this road and getting in your way when you're trying to run down the street, but yet is believable. And it's not a joke in a sense. You know what I mean? Sometimes when you get comedy writing, they're more concerned with the jokes. They want to put in a reference. And that's the other problem too, I think, with a lot of comedy writing. It's topical. As an editor, I've gotten stories that are very funny, that are making fun of things happening today. And I know if someone reads this novel 5 years from now, they're not going to get it. And that's a problem with comedy writing as well. I think people sometimes forget that you need to, at least as an editor, when I'm editing, I want a story that's going to still resonate years from now too.
I would actually say that would go for any story. The moment that you add something that is in popular culture, it's going to become dated very quickly. And anyone maybe 10, 12 years from now, certainly not 100 years from now, are not going to understand the story. When you want to include popular culture or a current reference, you need to explain it in a way that, funny or not, that explains it to the reader who is not familiar with the source material. Because even today, I won't get references for a number of things. Sports comedy is going to go right over my head and so on. You need to make it funny for everybody.
Well, I like to live dangerously because, to quote Bender, my books are 40% pop culture references. And I think that there is a trick to it, and you don't want to chase the latest meme that people are going to forget 6 months from now. But if you make a Star Wars reference or a Batman reference or anything along those lines, it is likely that 20, 30 years from now, people will easily recognize those. If you start getting really obscure, that's when you're falling into the danger of like, oh, hey, I'm going to date myself real fast now.
Oh, yeah.
And also, if your entire joke depends on something that is pop culture, it's going to fail fairly soon.
I also see a distinction between your characters referencing these things in dialogue and you sort of sticking it in there as a joke that your characters don't get, if you see what I mean. I've read books where a character goes to a school and it's basically a satire of Harry Potter, and you can tell it's a satire of Harry Potter, but the character doesn't know that because in their world Harry Potter doesn't exist. And that to me is going to be like, oh, well, that's an easy joke, I guess I should say. Whereas if your character makes a Harry Potter reference, I think that's a little bit different, because you're right, people are still going to be reading Harry Potter in the future, and you can make a Wizard of Oz reference and that's 100 years old and people will get that as well. So certain things I think can still be used. And you mentioned about short fiction and novels and how it's much easier to do comedy in a short fiction. Can you think of any good comedy novels that held up all the way through the novel?
Oh, I mean, there's a lot. Like, I mean, you named several of the authors that
Douglas Adams, one I was thinking, yes.
Douglas Adams, Terry Pratchett, Robert Asprin. Let's see.
Robert Asprin sort of, to me, mixes, because there's still a story underneath there. There's still a plot and characters can get in terrible trouble.
Mm-hmm.
Well, writing comedy doesn't preclude you from using the plot. I mean, it's just something that relies more and leans more on the humor than a typical action series. But some of the books by Mike Resnick, for example, some of them are clearly comedic, while others just have some jokes and some humor references in them. So it just depends on how you choose to craft a particular story.
And you need to give the audience a balance. I just read a very interesting quote from Gene Wilder, who said that he considered the movie The World's Greatest Lover to be one of his failures because he made the main character goofy and he made the surroundings goofy. Really successful movies that are humorous have one or the other. Not everybody is a goofball. You need a point of reference for the audience to understand it.
Oh, sure.
There's somebody who is knowledgeable and is observing, or the setting is straightforward and everyone else is looking at the main character and saying, what's wrong with him?
Well,
Somebody has to play it straight.
well, that's, yeah, the Marx Brothers would not be as funny if everyone else is just as crazy as they are. They have to play off.
Without Margaret Dumont, they
Yes.
wouldn't be nearly as well appreciated.
One of the problem, okay, as editors, as people who have edited and who have read and taught, writing, what are the biggest mistakes you see with writers who try to write humor? What can you tell us any stories about failures or really big successes that you weren't expecting? Because the problem is everyone thinks they're funny, but not everyone is.
Most people overdo it. They try to just really wedge in the humor into a story that was not meant to be a humorous story from the beginning. And it's very, very noticeable. It's like, it's just there with some duct tape and like spackle and it's falling apart. And, like it's almost cartoonish. But another is the opposite problem, where you have a story that has an inherently humorous plot, and the author is just trying to completely tell it straight, and it's sort of using this like 1950s analog voice, of a, kind of like how you write a bad science fiction story because that's what you think a science fiction story is supposed to sound like, and you try to like completely eliminate any element of voice that that's different, just tell it as straight as possible. When people do that, even if they have a potentially funny plot, it just doesn't work. So voice, I think, is the most important thing that I look for when I look at a story. If I, read a few paragraphs and it just reads bland to me, then I'm done. I can move on to the next one.
I also say commit to the joke. If you're going to tell a humorous story, make it funny. I know that sounds like a very simplistic thing, but some people will allude to the fact that this is supposed to be humorous without ever making it funny. And like science fiction or fantasy, which need to have a science fiction or fantasy idea, an element that brings about the conclusion to the story, you need to have what's funny about your world bring the story to a conclusion. You need to have that there at the end to make it successful. Like any good joke, and the punchline needs to sufficiently have picked up on the framework, on the buildup.
There's also the important element of don't rely on just the punchline to make your story funny. You need humor throughout the story. If all it is the big buildup to one joke, a modern editor is not going to generally like it.
Unless it's a really short story. I mean, the whole story is a joke. I mean, Asimov did it. Where the whole point was
right, but that's not a modern story.
Yeah, no.
Right. Today, like, would you want a Shaggy Dog story today, like in any of your projects?
Yeah, I guess you're right. They're just not selling. So advice for writers is don't do Shaggy Dog stories, unless someone's doing an anthology called Shaggy Dog Stories,
which has been done. So you won't be first.
That's true. I guess the key is, can you train somebody to be funny? Can you train a writer to say, here's how you do it? What kind of advice can you give to a writer to make sure that they're not killing the joke or
timing?
Yes.
Do you want to elaborate?
Well, certainly part of it is not interrupting somebody while they're asking a question, but the whole point is cadence. If you're writing a short story, you need to use the tools that we have available to us in terms of typography, pauses, ellipses, dashes, and so on, stressing things, exaggeration. All of these things can help to make something very funny, particularly exaggeration, and the twist in the tail that says, oh, yes, I didn't see that coming, and that's what made me laugh.
Mm-hmm.
So all of these tools are available to a writer, but you need to look at it and say, did this really make anybody else laugh? Am I the only one who thinks it's funny?
One best ways I think that you can inject a little bit of humor if you don't think you are very funny necessarily. You can be funny on occasion, and usually we all are, especially people who write at a professional level, are capable of cracking a funny joke. So if you make all the people around you laugh in some completely unrelated nonfiction setting, memorize that joke. Figure out if you can mine that, you can steal from yourself, is the way that I like to put it. Steal from yourself. If you say something funny while you're out at dinner and everybody laughs, make a note of it and see if you can use it in the story, because that's actual humor that was not forced and it worked. You already had an audience that liked it because they laughed. So
And you can pick it up anywhere on buses, listen to people who are under anesthesia, mind the available humor.
I think it's also important to voice. You had mentioned voice earlier, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about that, because some people just don't write funny. Even if their story is funny, the voice doesn't really carry it. I guess that goes along with cadence as well, and and timing and everything else. I had an editor one time for one of my novels who did not get that, and I had a funny scene, and she wanted me to add some lines leading up to it. And I said, well, no, now you're telegraphing the joke. You can't do that. And she didn't get it. And so some people just aren't funny. So I'm not sure how you can teach that. I'm sorry, I'm just rambling a bit, but I'd talk a little about voice, I think, is what I wanted to ask about.
I don't know if you can teach somebody to be funny. I had a friend relating to me a situation with her condo buildings homeowners association, the city blocking off all the exits to the parking lot, and more things that the more she told me, the funnier I thought it was. And I'm practically lying on the floor laughing. And she said, I don't understand what was funny about that. But it was the essence of building one facet and one thing on top of another until it was such a ridiculous situation. I was laughing, but she wasn't.
I think it's important to know that you're not trying to become a stand-up comedian. Like, I write funny stories, but if you throw me up on the stage, I'm gonna die on that stage, guaranteed. So you don't need to be funny on demand. You have time. You have time to think it through. And that perfect response that you failed to come up with when somebody said something to you that you thought of like 2 hours later, when you're writing a book or a story, that's fine because you can go back and edit it. So so you have the time to process and to come up and try different things, run it by beta readers. And you don't necessarily need to become a comedian. You just need to be able to inject enough humor into your story in order to add, that's just one of the spices that you're using in order to prepare the dish that is your story.
I would also add, figure out where you want the audience to smile, where you want to sort of have them step away from the serious moments. If you're interjecting humor, if you're writing a comedy book, that's something completely different. But where do you want them to break? Study the structure of your own story, understand the structure of your own story. And that takes a lot of practice and a lot of thoughtful contemplation of your plot, because you may discover that the place where you want to interject a little bit of humor would otherwise break really important dramatic tension, and that doesn't work, and it can completely destroy a good chapter. So where does it work? Where doesn't it work? Take a good look at your plot and think about that.
Jody, when you're coming up with ideas for novels, do you think of the humor first, or do you think of the plot first?
I think quite often an idea will strike me as funny, but I will have come up with probably the initial idea for it and then decide that, hey, that's funny. I wrote a vampire story many years ago that as I was reading it, it struck me as funnier and funnier, and I really enjoyed that. But I had set out to write something kind of straightforward and YA, but it had a lot of usable humor in it. And also the situation lent itself pretty fantastically to humor. So I suppose I come up with the plot and then I start to see the comic elements of it. And contrary wise, there are also ones that I think of and I wonder if I can make it funny, and I can't.
Mm-hmm. Alex, what about you?
By the time I sit down to write the story, I already know whether or not it's going to be humorous because I'm going to approach writing it in a very, very different way. But at the very inception of it, when you come up with an idea, the idea itself could be pretty well removed from how you're going to tell the story, right? Once you come up with this nugget of, hey, this is what I want to do, then you start kind of, developing it and like kind of noodling it in your head, and you figure out, okay, well, what is the best way to present this to the reader? How do I, take this, because an idea itself usually is a pretty boring thing, even if it's a good idea. So
Mhm.
you have to, you have to code it in many, many layers of something interesting, right? And what I like to refer to that is, as you write, is something called reader cookies. You need to feed a reader a cookie every few pages. Something, it could be a joke, it could be an unexpected plot twist. It could be some kind of a surprising development. It could be a cool visual, something where the reader stops for just a fraction of a second, goes, "Oh, cool," and that's so my very unscientific method is to make sure that I feed those cookies very consistently, and that's how you keep the reader with you, and they will forgive a lot if those cookies taste delicious.
I like that reference. There's a question asking about markets. Let's say you want to write short story besides UFO. Actually, tell us about that, Alex. And can you think of any other examples? I mean, do the major, where does one send humorous stories?
So part of the reason I started the UFO series is that there's very little room in the mainstream science fiction magazines for humor. Like they may take one story per issue as a kind of like, hey, here's our humorous story. But if you're writing a lot of humor, it's difficult to place. Some places that are surprisingly amenable to it for example, Nature. The Journal of Nature love humorous stories. Of course, they do have to be very short and they have to be relatively science-minded, so to fit their criteria, but they're very, I would almost say they're suckers for humor stories. They really, really like them. FNSF is a good example. Daily Science Fiction is a good example. But Intergalactic Medicine Show was very open to humor back when it was around. Galaxy's Edge magazine is very open to humor. So there are pro-paying markets that will take humor stories, but you are making it even more difficult on yourself by like that extra level of difficulty when you're writing a comedy story that is not meant for an invitation anthology or something.
That said, the traditional science fiction and fantasy magazines have been known to accept humor, and some of it has done very well. Esther Friesner's Jesus at the Bat, for example, was, I think, FNSF. And certainly Stan Schmidt, when he was editing Analog, was open to humor.
Yeah, and they're still open to humor now, as I understand it. Like but again, you're not going to see more than one humorous story per issue. So and usually less than that. So again, it's your story has to be the best humorous story that they're seeing that month, or that whatever like purchase period that they're working with.
What are you tired of seeing that when people submit to UFO, for instance? What are you tired of plots that you said, oh God, not this again?
So I actually have a list posted on our guidelines, and most of it are stories that just have been done to death. So alien abduction plots, genie or other magical creature with wishes, deals with the devil or demons. Those are all stories that just have been done so many times. And then there's at least tropey, vampire and other like urban fantasy stories that are just retreading the same jokes that we've seen on the TV screen, but they're not really doing anything new. And I think the latest addition to that are the modern day political stories, where they're making fun of, it's fine that if you want to make fun of our leaders, but you have to do a better job than Stephen Colbert's writing room, because we've seen all of those jokes on Colbert. And if you're doing a worse job than his writers, then it's really, really obvious because we've all seen them.
Jody?
I have to defer to Alex because normally when I submit humor, it's because I've been asked to.
I guess the next question is, someone asked about categorizing certain books. Kill the Farm Boy was a fairly successful I see your head shaking.
I don't know what that means.
Oh, there's a novel that came out called Kill the Farm Boy, and I can't remember the author's name right now, but there was another one she wrote that I just finished reading, which was called The Princess Beard. And it's very comedy. It's a comedy novel, but it's major publisher, you know, and it's selling well. I would put that in the comedy section myself, since the person in question asked about that. And I think that's one of the things that I hope she's not watching, I wasn't really happy with. I mean, I enjoyed reading it. It was funny, but I could have put it down and never picked it back up again because I didn't care about the plot or the characters really. I liked the jokes, but that's the one that had the reference to Harry Potter in it. And I thought, well, you know, that's going to be dated someday, I assume.
So I haven't read Kill the Farm Boy, but I have heard of it. I think it might qualify as satire because it is attempting to lampoon the tropes of an existing genre. I mean, it's basically like making fun of the hero's journey, right? So,
Yeah.
so I would say satire.
Well, I haven't read that one, but the one I did read was definitely tying in all kind of references and puns and things. You know, it was the whole point of the book was let's make jokes, which I enjoyed reading in bits, but I'm not sure that the book didn't hold me in a way that a story would hold me. So that was my opinion, since someone asked about that. All right. The problem with those kind of books, when you write that kind of stuff, is you might laugh and you might think it's good, but, you know, I'm not going to pick that book up and reread it like I will, you know, Robert Asperin's book, for instance. You know, I've reread, you know, some of the Myth Adventures more than once. And that's the keys. You know, you want to reread those things. Anyway, all right, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that John Scalzi, back when he was doing the tour for Red Shirts, he actually talked extensively about that. And some of a key point that he was making is that when you undertake writing a humorous book, that level of danger is a lot higher, because if you write a traditional just drama, people may like it a little or they may like it a lot, but there's a significantly smaller chance that they'll hate it. Whereas when you write a humorous book, it's very often either like or hate. Like there's very little of that in the middle space where you like it a little bit. So I think that this is an example, Mike, of the book where it just did not work for you. Another reader might absolutely love it, based on their sales record, probably a fair number of readers, but they're not going to satisfy everyone. And this is true for absolutely any humorous book, no matter how successful.
Or movies. I can't understand why people think Adam Sandler is funny, for instance, you know, but somebody likes them. It's not my kind of humor.
People like Woody Allen, and I really do not.
Oh, I like his early stuff, but that's the joke. You like his early stuff, of course. I don't like him personally, but you know, I found the early stuff funny. All right, I've sort of run through the questions I was going to ask about humor. What other questions, what other comments do you think we should discuss that we haven't discussed yet, Jody or Alex, as far as advice for the writer who wants to do this?
I would say an important facet of humor is it's very subjective. The parts of humor that are not subjective are ones that depend on the human condition. For example, everybody knows an overprotective mother. Everybody knows a lazy slob. Everybody knows a braggart. That kind of story you can tell, and most people will get it. It's when you start to introduce cultural references or ancient feuds between peoples that it starts to become more and more difficult for someone who is not involved in that situation, who doesn't know it, to get it. And the same goes for a lot of ethnic humor, military humor, or something that is situational to a selected group. So for an upcoming writer who wants to add humor to things, you are safer having archetypal humor than you are in delving into a cultural one, unless you're really good at explaining things that don't bog down your narrative.
If I could expand on that a little bit, part of what I do is translation. And nowhere is what Jody is talking about is more clear than in translation, because all of a sudden, if you have a story that is hilarious in the Russian language, it may not work at all for an American audience because it's relying on tropes and cultural references and all sorts of points that are never really mentioned in the story directly, but they're kind of alluding to things that are totally foreign to our readers. And so you have to find the stories that are more universal. Having said that, I do think that it's a really good idea to mine your cultural, heritage and references. So, I grew up reading a lot of Yiddish humor, a lot of Russian humor, a lot of Ukrainian humor, and a joke or an expression that is cliche in those languages and in those cultures may read completely fresh to an American audience. So to give you an example, an expression, "not my monkeys, not my circus," is a very common idiom in, I believe, in Poland, if I'm not mistaken.
I think it is Polish, yeah, but it only sort of surfaced 6-8 years ago around here.
Right, exactly. And but if anybody who would have used that in their English language book, being familiar with the original Polish, would appear to be a genius to the readers, because they're like, oh wow, that's such a cool expression. But all they're doing is they're translating it from another language that they speak. So don't be afraid to use those sorts of things. Just don't over rely on cultural references and things that are so unique to your culture that they will be incomprehensible.
I think the source of that one is not the problem. People have heard of circuses and monkeys, so
Right.
that makes it more general purpose.
Jody, you had mentioned earlier about talking about doing stuff too early, too soon, when you make a joke too soon. What were you referring to there?
When I start to hear stories about 9/11 or Black Lives Matter or anything that has recently been in the news as a major issue, it's too soon. People are not going to think it's funny. They're going to think that you're insensitive and possibly tune you out for the rest of your bit. So I would measure that, as the comedians always say, read the room. When you want to introduce something that is possibly controversial, judge whether or not your audience is going to be receptive enough not to walk out on you or put the book down and never pick it up again. Are you able to handle it in a respectful way? Or is it a joke that really shouldn't be told yet, if ever?
And it's a really, really tough call to make. I mean, you can make fun of almost anything, as long as, even the recent events, as long as you're doing it with respect and love and you're not coming from a place of meanness. But that has to really come through in your jokes. If it's clear to you, but it's not clear to your audience, they will have a really bad time, and then after that, so will you. So it's important to run it by beta readers, check, err on the side of caution, but don't be too cautious, because if your jokes are completely toothless, they will not be good either.
We rely on our readers' goodwill. We establish with them a contract, if you will. I will say something funny, you will laugh at it. I will try to keep your sensibilities in mind. And there are lots and lots and lots of topics that I would say would be no-go. But there are people who would go there. Honestly, there are comedians who will do that. But when you go to see them, you expect that. Or if you pick up a book by somebody that has a controversial sense of humor, you're doing that of your own free will.
Terry Pratchett always talked about punching up, and that was, he said that
always punch up, never punch down.
It's bullying. And I think that sort of plays into what you're just saying right there too, right?
I think
Yes.
that's universal, yeah.
Okay. I guess my only final question would be, if you're trying to write, it's so hard to teach it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. What would you advise someone to look for if they're trying to put some humor besides just having jokes in it? What kind of advice would you give someone to make sure that their story has at least some humor in it?
Have someone who needs the situation explained to them, perhaps, and have the person that they're trusting to explain it to them not do it terribly well, so that there are some misunderstandings. Misuse of possibly common equipment or common expressions can be funny. Misinterpretation is always ground that can be mined for humor. Exaggeration. there are a lot of different tools that you can use in order to introduce that. Like take your child to work day, or take your alien to work day.
So,
There's an idea.
now you have to write that one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
The source of humor can come from almost anywhere, and you need to be, just like we are always looking out for ideas for stories. We should also be, if you're interested in adding humor to your stories, you should always be on the lookout for ideas for humor. My best short story by far, my most popular one and most successful one, is Explaining Cthulhu to Grandma, and the title came from a Twitter conversation. And it was a friend of mine, a fellow writer, who just said, I'm having a difficult time explaining Cthulhu to my grandmother, or to my mother, actually, at that point. And I'm like, Explaining Cthulhu to Grandma would be a great short story title. And we had a laugh about it. And it just stuck with me. And after like about a week, it still stuck with me. So I asked her, hey, are you planning on using that ever? And she's like, well, no, I wasn't going to write anything with it. Do you mind if I do? And that's how that story was born. Another time, Esther Friesner, myself, and several others had a Facebook conversation about the difficulty and danger of circumcising dragons. Several short stories were born from that, including one by Esther that I published in UFO, and one by me that was published, I believe, in IJMS. And I think at least one other person who participated in that thread wrote a story as well. So you don't know where that joke is going to come from, but you should always have an ear out. And if you hear something funny, if there's something you think you can make it work, grab it.
That reminds me of how we came up with my anthology, Release the Virgins, which is very similar. Someone was talking about doing an experiment with flies, and they had to release the virgins. And I went, wow, that'd be a great title for an anthology where every story had to use the words "release the virgins" in it. And of course, it's at a convention and we're all sitting at the bar. That's when usually these ideas happen, of course. And immediately people are going, I'll write a story, I'll edit it, I'll publish it. You never know where an idea is going to come from. You got to jump on it. I'll agree with you there. And that was a very successful anthology, actually, right, Alex?
Yes, it was. I'm very proud to have a story in it, and that story is slowly growing into a novel. So,
oh, excellent.
That novel pitch is on submission with a publisher. So if they greenlight it, I may have to write that book real quick.
Excellent.
Hoping it works.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I wrote several short stories in that universe already. So I kind of sent them, I'm like, hey, here's the first, 15,000 words or so, because I already wrote them and they were all published as short stories. And now I can just continue edit that. Here's a synopsis, so we'll see how that works out.
I've got a question here that says, Alex used the term gentle humor. Can you define that for someone who's asking?
I don't remember the context in which I used it. I think I was mostly talking about something that isn't mean-spirited, isn't very sharp, isn't divisive, but just rather using the humor on something that's relatively non-controversial that people will have it's a feel-good humor is how I would put it. But I'm kind of making that up as I go along. I haven't dwelled on it, to be honest.
Jody, you were about to say something, and I'm sorry, I think I interrupted. All right.
Doesn't matter.
All right, well, let's conclude then, because we've been almost an hour now. And I'd like each of you to tell us about what you're working on now, tell us where we can find your work, and explain to anyone listening why they should read your work. Alex, you're smiling bigger, so you can go first.
Okay, so I actually kind of queued something up for a previous question. I'm going to put a link in the chat. And this is an article that I wrote, I think, at this point 10 years ago, but it's still really valid, and it's 5 practical tips for writing humor. So actual things, I mentioned some of them during this panel, and I believe Jody mentioned some of them as well, but this is something that you can actually read and see if you can apply it to your work. So I'm going to start with that. As far as my work, this book just came out. It's only been out for a few months. It's doing really well, and I highly recommend that you check it out for yourself. I have signed a contract and actually this morning delivered the manuscript for the sequel to the publisher. So book 2 will be coming out next year. And last but not least, the next UFO volume, UFO 9, is in its final 48 hours on Kickstarter. And we're in a little bit of trouble. We're actually much further behind than we usually are at this point. And I blame, the rising gas prices, Putin, and everything else that Biden blames. So he's right, so we need help. if you guys are interested in supporting it by pre-ordering a copy or just by sharing the link to the Kickstarter campaign, I have it all over my social media, so you can grab the link there. And you will not be disappointed if you grab a copy of this book or of the previous volumes as part of your rewards. There are excellent stories in there. And Jody is, I believe you've been in every single volume, right, Jody?
All but one.
All but one.
Circumstances beyond my control.
Yes, so very close. So I think Jody for a long time was tied with Mike Resnick for how many volumes they've been in, but unfortunately Mike is no longer with us. So as of
So maybe I'll catch up.
you're about to take the lead, I believe, because he's been gone from 8 and 9, and you'll have a story in 9. So you're about to take the lead.
Jody?
Well, what I'm working on right now is the next Myth Adventures novel. I have, in fact, even written short stories set in the Myth Adventures universe, which I have had huge fun with. The series was begun by Robert Asprin with Another Fine Myth. It is full of terrible puns, but undying friendship. And I think that's why people cotton to it, is that there are good stories in there and great characters, but the situations are absurd. And I write my own humorous short stories. I've got one coming out in the 4 question marks of the apocalypse, and 3 time travelers walk into ... Edited by one Michael Ventrella. So those are coming up soon. And Thrilling Adventure Yarns 3, which we're also Kickstartering. But in the meantime, that one has a little longer to go. So please pack the Kickstarter for UFO 9. And let's see what else. Oh, you can find my books on Amazon, and you can order them directly from Wordfire Press, Prince of Cats Press, Spain Books, and so on.
And I'm Michael Ventrella. You heard mention of 3 time travelers walk into ... which is the most recent anthology I've edited, which Jody is in. Alex, of course, was in an anthology I've edited as well. I'm working on new ones. I've got a couple of novels out. My most recent one is called Big Stick. It's a steampunk adventure with Teddy Roosevelt and Mark Twain. And just seeing those two argue with each other was so much fun to write, and very humorous, I might add. So there's a lot I'm working on michaelaventrella.com. That's about all I have to say, everyone. Everyone go and sign up for UFO, and be sure to get 3 time travelers walk into ... Oh, and I will also be in Keith's book about the question marks of the apocalypse too. My story is 4 lawyers of the apocalypse. It's called Horsemen, 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 and Horsemen, Attorneys at Law. So I'm looking forward to that book coming out too, because I want to read everyone else's stories.
Mine is called Apocalypse.
And
I bet you can't guess.
the 4 cats of the apocalypse.
Yep.
Perfect. I'm looking forward to
also gone with Catastrophe.
Catastrophe. All right, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm sorry about the mix-up with the time. And you can, all of us, I'm sure, will be more than happy to talk to you if you want to send us questions on email or social media. Jody and Alex have always been very good about helping everyone with their questions. So thank you very much, everyone. I will be posting this very soon.
Thank you for tuning in. Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you for listening.
I can't find the button that says stop video. There it is. No, that's not what I want. I want stop recording is what I'm looking for, and I can't find it. I'll have to edit.
That was not the button.
Thank you, everyone. As soon as I can figure out how to turn the recording off, I will let everyone know. And I will be posting this as soon as possible. There it is. Stop recording. Thank you.
Hey.